Hi, everybody. This is Kevin from RPH Ally and Andrea from RPH Ally, and we're super excited to come to you today. Andrea's got a lot of great stuff in the works in her patient advocacy channel, and she's always teaching me kind of along the way. And so I think the one thing that we're going to talk about today is related to a webinar that Andrea has coming up that I'll let her talk to you more about, but really is along the lines of being better communicators. I think we all recognize that with this distant society and with everything being online, it's pretty laughable because I'm looking at one of my friends that we have not met yet in person and all communicating online, that we've lost some abilities to communicate well. And we need to be able to retrain ourselves on how to do that well. One way to do that sometimes is showcasing how we've not done it well. And talk about some embarrassing stories that, as Andrew and I were laughing about the other day, if you've practiced for 5 minutes, you've had the opportunity to stick your foot in your mouth and say, why did I do it that way? So without further ado, Andrea, I'm going to pass it over to you to tell us about some of those moments you've experienced and then some of the lessons you've learned to kind of help the audience to, see where they can benefit.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin, for doing this with me. And as you said, we over at RPH Ally on the patient advocacy channel, tomorrow I have a guest speaker, Dr. Bruce Berger, PhD, motivational interviewing guru. And we were talking, and how this all came about is he and I were talking about, while I'm a healthcare provider, I'm a pharmacist, yes, I practice now as a patient advocate. And I am so aware of how patients are not the center of many of our patient-centered processes that I find myself pausing or stopping or being fearful of saying the wrong thing to where I actually just don't speak. And so there could be like this frozen deer in the headlight experience when I'm talking with a client or a potential client, because like my mind is like, oh, you have to recognize they're the center, but the problem solving of my pharmacist training wants to just jump in and be like, oh, this is what we do. And so yeah, in terms of communication, I have a couple of funny stories. And I'll share the first one and I'll pass it over to you so you can embarrass yourself, and then you can pass it back to me if you want. So we're not all, we're just not all on me.
Yeah.
And the first one was back when I was, so within my patient advocacy, my private practice, I am a travel health coach. And so I was building a program. I was working with my business mentor group. And, so there's a number of participants in the group, and, we were talking. And so I was doing a strategy session on what my program would look like for travel health and wellness. And they were like, okay, so tell me what the scenario is. And I was like, oh, well, so imagine you were traveling overseas and you get a bacterial infection. And then you have to go to this doctor and, you don't speak the language. And this is what happened to my husband. We ended up having the hotel had to call the doctor, and the doctor ended up, doing this IV. And it basically was like a broom closet that we were standing in. And, I watched how they did the IV technique, and, it was this hard plastic IV container. And he, takes a glass ampule and he sticks the needle in it. He doesn't use a filter, and then he just plunks it into the side of the bottle, and he just injects it, and then he hooks it up into my husband's arm. And I'm just like, my eyes are just like huge, and my husband's like, what? And I was like, no, I guess she didn't die, I guess it's okay. Meanwhile, this was like the outline of my program. And so my business colleagues are sitting there and they're looking at me and they're like, why would anybody want to travel with you if all you talk about is what would scare them? I was like, no. Don't you understand? I can solve all of that. I'm telling you the stuff that can go wrong and how I can fix it. Yeah. What I learned,
like slowly trying to get out of the room, like, oh man, this lady.
And, of course, like they're looking at me, and nobody in the room is a healthcare provider. They're all different type of bit. And it was really in that moment that I realized, oh wow, a healthcare provider that transfers over into entrepreneurship has a lot to learn. And one is how we communicate. because in some ways I was scaring people before I even, got to the whole point about how I could help them. And so by the time we got to the end of the conversation, they were like, look, I'll just sit at home. I'm not going to travel. I'll watch it on Discovery Channel. I'm good in the safety of my home, because they had never realized all the things that could go wrong because
Right.
I was just, I had just launched.
Well,
So yeah, not one of my finer moments in communication. And so, yeah, hopefully I've learned in the 2 years.
Landed clients, even with those really exciting stories. You
Yeah.
did nice. Hey, there you go. Maybe your sales
Well,
tactic.
no, actually, did you say, did I get clients? No, I came not with those stories. No, I definitely learned how to message better.
So funny. So all the one I have for you, Andrea, that cracks me up is just it's like background understanding. And so for me, being a kid that grew up on a farm, oftentimes the things that I'll describe. And for me, I love to draw. Like I'm not an artist by any means, but if I'm describing something to someone about how a drug works or what their body's going through, I love to be able to just draw simple pictures to help them kind of understand things. And so me making the assumption that some of these folks like have a background in agriculture, to be able to connect the dots has really bitten me a few times with them looking at me like I'm absolutely crazy. Like, what are you drawing? What is this irrigation pump? And what are these different channels and you're siphoning stuff? Like, I have no idea about this. And for me, like in my head, it was like, oh, this is brilliant, Kevin. Like this is going really well. Like this is so easy to understand. And in their mind, they're thinking like, you couldn't have made this any worse for me. Like before I was confused and now I've got to learn your analogies and be even more confused. And so that was one that I think for me, like the lesson there was really context, right? I mean, getting the background of individuals and getting to know them, as human beings, it really helps with us being able to deploy any communication tactic that we're going to utilize. So those very rudimentary drawings that Kevin was doing could hopefully actually help them understand rather than make them more confused about their disease state and wish that they found a better artist to describe it.
Right. Well, I think you bring up a great point with that because, like, with my initial situation, looking at that communication in terms of like business development and, because at RPH Ally, we're talking, of course, we have to support the education, the opportunity piece, and yet we have these opportunities to be able to share how we built businesses. My communication was definitely that default that healthcare has helped many healthcare providers that jump into problem solve before truly understanding what the person's challenge was. And so for me, launching into problems and being excited because I could provide a solution, that was kind of my, that was an incorrect assumption and could create fear and stress. You're talking about context with your situation. And so having an understanding of like where people are coming from, honoring like who they are, meeting people where they are, right? And so you default to what you know, but instead of finding those examples that the person would understand. And it's interesting because I have that right now with a client where the language I'm using when I talk about health optimization, oftentimes I love cars and high performance vehicles. And so I described, the human body in a lot of terms of like, the carburetor or the engine and putting bad fuel in. And yet with this individual, because of their background, I use things like if you were knitting, you'd want the most luxurious yarn, and so, or like if you were painting, using terms that, that makes sense to them because there's parallels, there's other examples, but it's the language that they use, understanding where they're coming from. So it's much more of meeting them where they are.
I love that. Yeah, I think the some of the things that I pulled out, I looked at a kind of recent like study or article that was out there, and you and I have talked about like a few things in the motivational interviewing space, which I'm really looking forward to you and Bruce kind of jumping into that because I feel like it's a really common misperception. I remember even when I was a student, like thinking about that phrase, motivational interviewing, right? You're thinking you're going to be motivating someone through the interviewing process, and that couldn't be right. And which is an interesting thing of like, what is someone's internal motivations? How do you connect with those? How are you able to help them in their own journey, achieve some of those goals and then connect those things back and forth, utilize language that's appropriate inside of the space and not objectify, individuals. And so I love that. Some of the things that were in this article, Andrea, I'd love to get your thoughts on just in general, like just really short takes on things that you've done or things that you think about these statements. So the first one was to develop a welcoming ritual, which I think is interesting because I even think about family. Like sometimes you can just go into a family function and there's not the usual like, hey, how you doing? You get a hug, you talk about, kind of life, and it's rushed and you just get to it right away. And the interesting thing about the overall experience of that is it doesn't feel right. Like it doesn't feel like you've really connected and like you've really had those meaningful moments with somebody because you skipped what a lot of people think is just, fluff off the top. It's not. Like it really helps people feel comfortable and connected. So do you have anything like that, Andrea, that you use with your clients? Do you have a ritual of how you kind of connect with each other right off the bat?
It's interesting. I do. And it's very physical and I just do it. Even on the phone, I'll tell someone, hello, or how are you doing? And then I just say, okay, I'm just going to take a pause for a moment and take a deep breath. Now let's talk. And I just like, because it's almost like I need that physical reset.
Yeah.
To stop the immediate assumptions, problem solving, to just be there. So I just tell them I'm going to pause. I'm going to take a deep breath. And it just sets my nervous system a little differently. I try to make sure it's like deep in the diaphragm as opposed to like up here in my chest where I tend to breathe most of the time. The more I learn about breath work, and that way I just feel like I'm better dialed into the whole experience.
Wow. Yeah, I think that you talked about breath work there, and I think one thing that I've seen and one thing I just heard today, I was visiting with Sean Casey, and he told me something about his travels over in Hong Kong with a given client. And he was saying that, interestingly, it wasn't like the providers in Hong Kong didn't ask him once about his client who had back pain, about his height, his blood pressure, anything like that. It was all about his breathing. Like they wanted to know what kind of breathing exercises he did.
Yeah.
And which was interesting because of all the benefits related to breathing exercises. But you bring up one that's really interesting of just like recentering ourselves, being able to focus in the moment. And I've seen several colleagues of mine that I feel like are experts in the space. Some will flip a chair around. I remember there was a waiter one time and he was genius and he got tipped well, but he came up to the table and instead of, rushing through the order, he grabbed a chair and he flipped it around in a circle, sat backwards, and just put his arms on the table and asked us like what we wanted to eat. And the experience was fantastic. And I've seen physicians, I've seen pharmacists do something very similar where they almost sit in a different way so that they know they are disconnected from the rest of their environment so they can focus on that individual in front of them. And I really appreciate that. Like I really appreciate the willingness for someone to go out of their way to mentally disconnect from everything else they could be thinking about and be able to focus just on you and just on the patient. So I think that's real gold. I'll go through some of the other ones real quick. I think be present is the exact same thing, in lots of ways, right? Choose positive words. I did just watch something, Andrea, that I think was interesting of using the word and instead of but. In right various scenarios, which is interesting because grammatically it might not be as correct. But from an emotional, like receiving standpoint, a lot of negative like feelings and connotations when you're using the word but in a sentence that feels like everything here is positive, but this is all negative, or this is all your fault, or this is going to be a problem. And so that was one that I saw that I thought was interesting in terms of phrasing, but also just to get the mood in the correct direction, because sometimes we can have such uncomfortable conversations that allowing them to spiral happens. Nonverbal communication. I think you're great at that. Like I notice it when we're talking, right? I mean, eye movements, the way that you kind of posture yourself toward the screen, head nodding, lots of things that Because for me, like I'm a natural like hands talker, and I try to be expressive, right, in general, which is so funny watching myself back on screen. But I think the nonverbal communication, like that ability for people to see you're listening, highly undervalued. Like I feel like there's something about it that's neat. And I know within like me growing up being Native American, a common way to have conversations, standing in a circle, all of us outside after hunting or something else that we're doing, telling stories and all looking down at our feet. No eye contact, and that's just like the natural way that we connect. So for me, that nonverbal communication, sometimes that once again has to be shifted based on context, based on the individuals I'm talking to, because face to face, expressive Kevin may not be as well received, depending on someone's background. I'll skip the rest on there, Andrea, but was wondering, do you have any other ones that have served you well, like tips you've been like, this has helped me be a more successful communicator?
One that I find interesting in the advocacy space, and not that it doesn't serve in traditional healthcare as well, but degrees of familiarity. And so when we want to talk about those embarrassing stories, sometimes I find that the closer we are to people, that we forget that we should offer them the same compassion, empathy, some of the niceties that we would offer complete strangers, because those degrees of closeness, it can come across, in a way that changes the tone. And the example I'll use, and my sister has allowed me to share the story because it's been on social media, but she went to a doctor. She thought she was having some issues, and in 15 minutes walks out with a prescription and an appointment to come back in 1 year. So the minute she calls me, and she's like stressed out because now she's got this prescription and, the diagnosis, and it really wasn't a diagnosis, but because of one lab value, the doctor is writing this prescription, come back in a year. Because it was my sister, I was like, well, why the hell didn't you call me? And immediately, because we're on the phone, and my sister I'm the big sister, but she's physically bigger. She's 5'10", and I'm 5'5" if I'm properly hydrated. And so I could just envision her like stopping and just like, and she's like, what, in the middle of the appointment? And I was like, well, yeah, he works for you. Because, for me, it was protection of my baby sister, even though we're grown-ups, and my frustration at the healthcare system and all that baggage that we bring into healthcare, right? Like, how dare that doctor with one data point write a prescription, and not ask her about all these other things. That's what's in my mind. And yet my familiarity with her comes across almost like attacking her action, which in some ways I straight up did.
Yeah.
Assuming that she knows that I care about her and I love her, and that, and so then I was like, unfortunately my pause regroup was too late, but I did have to do like, okay, I am sorry. Obviously I should not have done it that way. Let's back up. Tell me what happened, because I immediately had launched. And so I think that that's something, and the reason I share that is that within advocacy, so many times I talk to elder children that have a viewpoint about what's going on with their family.
Right.
And if the conversations are happening like that, no wonder there's pushback, because we are scared, we have fear, we're worried about our family, we love them. But if we're pointing out things in a way that come across as attacks, and we're not offering common ground or seeking win-win, or truly, dare I say, understanding the motivations for why they feel what they feel, hence the reason for Bruce being there tomorrow, we're defeating any ability that we have to serve with our knowledge, because we've already made everybody so pissed off.
Yeah.
And they want to hear from us. So improved.
It makes sense. I mean, it makes sense that you're dealing with very intimate situations when it comes to just someone's overall health and advocating for it. It also makes sense that a lot of times the clients that you're going to land, really regardless of what you're doing in the pharmacy consulting space or advocacy space, are probably going to be people that know and trust you. And so you're going to have potentially those relationships established with those clients. So being able to recognize the professionalism necessary in some of the, like you said, separating those degrees of familiarity so they get the exact same treatment is just as important. And I think it ties in so well with your conversation you're having tomorrow, which will let you tee up here on motivational interviewing, which Bruce and I have talked about a few separate times, is really related to what part of the brain are we going to when we're having a difficult conversation or someone brings something up where in the moment, all of a sudden we're protecting ourselves. We hit that fight or flight mentality rather than being able to rationalize and really deliver what we intend, to our given client, patient, etc. But Andrea, before we sign off, just the only thing I wanted to just pass it over to you. The things I'll say is, please join us at RPH Ally. Have your pharmacy technician or pharmacy license available. Register right now, totally free, to have access to a bunch of really brilliant people like Andrea, even though I keep pointing the wrong way, and I will do that forever because I get thrown off on the StreamYard. But check out Andrea's channel with patient advocacy. She has things going with a book club. She has a bunch of instructional materials. She has course guides, everything ready for you to take full advantage of patient advocacy, regardless if you're going to become a patient advocate and truly do that as your career, or include more patient advocate skills inside of your current vocation, so that you can better help your overall patients. But please, Andrea, tell us a little bit more about how we can get a hold of you, and also more about the webinar tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Eastern time, Bruce and we are going to try to keep it to 45 minutes. It's a live Zoom. So, I would love for people, if you're interested in this, it's motivational interviewing. Bruce, he got my attention. I mean, I've talked to him a number of times, but recently he told me, he goes, I think you're working way harder than you need to. And of course, in terms of being an entrepreneur and efficiency, I was like, okay, we need to dig deeper into the motivational interviewing space. So 9 a.m. tomorrow, Eastern Standard Time. If you come through RPH Ally, like you said, Kevin, it's free to join. And I've shared the information with the entire feed. So even if you're not part of the patient advocacy channel, which I would love you to join, but even if you're not, you could still find the information to register. And then that way you could be in the Zoom room and you could ask them, because that's the benefit. As much as, we all have our opinions about Zoom. The beauty is that, he's there. And this is the time to ask the questions. And so we want to leave 10 minutes for Q&A. He's running an amazing offer for his course. And as you said, we are also using his book as the inaugural book of the book club of patient advocacy. And he's leading us into this first conversation. And on deck, I've got a death doula coming up who also uses yoga therapy. We've got somebody who's going to talk about new ways of being buried coming up. And not that all we do is talk about death and patient advocacy, but we talk coming up. We've got some really interesting guest speakers, but Bruce is starting us off.
I love it. No, I'm so excited, Andrea. Well, thank you so much for the time today. And we look forward to folks joining us tomorrow.
Yay. Hope to see you there.
All right. Talk to you then. Bye-bye.